Welcome back from the coffee, tea, or whatever you did during this break. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you Kelly Garrett from the Ohio State University. He's one of the leading experts on selective exposure worldwide, and also was instrumental in reframing the debate from focusing mainly on the extent to which people sought out attitude-consistent information towards also discussing the extent to which people avoid attitude discrepant information. And this is a field where there are different points of view. So I really look forward to Kelly reviewing the evidence to let us know what the status is. The word is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to have a chance to speak with you, although of course it would be better if I were not doing it from such a great distance. Still, hopefully this will be an interesting conversation. So I'm going to start with some foundations just to set the stage for the conversation today. I imagine that you're all quite familiar with the terms that I'm going to talk about here, but let's just get some ground rules out. Selective exposure is the idea that people actively construct their media diets. This is a response to prior notions that media messages were inserted into individuals, and that individuals really weren't making choices about how they consumed. So their consumption decisions reflect individuals' mental states and also their psychological traits. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on politically motivated selective exposure, which Stroud has described as the motivated selection of messages matching one's own attitudes and beliefs. Research on attitudinally motivated selective exposure dates back to the mid-20th century, when it received considerable attention before falling out of favor for a few decades. It became popular again in the early 2000s, due in large part to the changing media environment and some of the provocative claims that were made about how that changing media environment would alter people's consumption of media in the future. Obviously, today, my focus is on the distinction between selective approach and selective avoidance. These are two independent behaviors. And first, let's talk about what they are. Approach is the behavior that follows from an attraction to pro-attitudinal information, while selective avoidance is the consequence of an aversion to counter-attitudinal messages. I say independent because one does not necessarily accompany the other, although it is understandable that you might think that they are linked. So in a media environment that includes a mix of messages, including both pro-attitudinal, counter-attitudinal, and two-sided messages, you can imagine that individuals could choose one, the other, or all three kinds of media. I also need to say just a brief word about the way that research has evolved over the last 2 decades. Perhaps most important of all of these changes is the fact that since these changes were inspired by the changing media environment, in particular by the rise of personal computing and the internet, fortunately for researchers, these technologies that promoted all the questions also promoted unique opportunities to study selective exposure. So unobtrusive logging of people's behavior has become a really important part of scholars' repertoire for understanding selective exposure. And this is particularly interesting in the context of computational social science, where scholars are able to observe millions of users over an extended period of time, acting in ways that have nothing to do with the lab, people just leading their lives and consuming media the way they normally do. Admittedly, it's within a constrained environment. That is, they're consuming the way they normally do when they are on their personal computer. But that is a large part of people's media diet these days. And so studies that use these tools provide interesting insights into the way that selective exposure works in the real world. The last meta point that I want to make to set the stage for the rest of my comments has to do with the consistency of results. So observational data has been crucial, but we also have a large body of experimental research and a fair number of studies that use survey data. And the thing that I find most striking looking across these results is how very consistent they are. And this is not a trivial fact. The fact that the patterns across these different modalities is striking, in part because of the ways that we know the different modalities are biased. So surveys have the problem of self-report. People aren't necessarily capable of reporting in an unbiased way what media they consume. And it's possible that the self-reporting biases shape the evidence for whether they're engaged in selective exposure or not. At the same time, the tracking studies are highly contingent on exactly who's participating. It takes an unusual person to volunteer to be part of a panel to have all of your behaviors observed for a year. And in some cases, the tracking data come from other services, like, say, for example, Facebook. There, it's less a question of did the person volunteer to participate by being a Facebook member. You are a guinea pig in a huge number of studies. But there's also the question of whether the researchers can accurately impute things like ideology when relying on behavioral data. Now, there's good evidence that they can, but again, there are questions about each of these methods. And experiments, of course, are prone to the kinds of biases that come when someone is brought into a lab or in participating in an online study. They know they're being observed. They may be guessing about what's going on. There may be pressures to behave in socially normative ways, and so forth. So the fact that we see consistent results across all of these methodologies, I think, should give us significant confidence in the patterns of results that I'm going to describe today. All right, so there are three things that I'd like you to remember by the end of my talk today. I say this up front because I'm going to present a lot of different pieces of evidence. I'm going to make a fairly nuanced set of arguments, but the bottom line is, when we're all done, I first hope that you recall that echo chambers are rare. And I'll talk about what I mean by echo chambers in just a moment, but they're it's hard to extricate the idea of echo chambers from the idea of selective exposure, especially in the popular media, but also in the academic literature. The second point that I'm going to try and convince you of is the idea that selective approach, the behaviors that reflect an attraction towards pro-attitudinal information, is more prevalent than selective avoidance, the tendency to avoid counter-attitudinal information. That, in fact, is part of the reason behind my first point. And the third point that I want to address is the role of social media and people's engagement with content there. I would suggest that the dynamics between selective approach and selective avoidance look different when people are making choices about consuming messages from what we might traditionally call mass media or news outlets, and when people are making choices about who to engage with, who to talk to, which kinds of comments to post on which kinds of content. Engagement is more prone to selective avoidance than exposure. So those are the 3 points that I'm hoping to convince you of today. Let's start with the first one. Let's talk a little bit about echo chambers. And to talk about echo chambers, of course, we have to start with a definition. So Sunstein, back in 2001, brought this idea to the foreground of research. He wasn't the only person talking about them, other scholars were, but he made a particularly provocative argument suggesting that the rise of high-choice online media environments were going to culminate in news consumers abandoning general interest intermediaries and retreating into what he called echo chambers, places where where news consumers would only ever hear echoes of their own opinions reflected back to them. The idea here is that you would never encounter information that might run counter to your own beliefs or attitudes. In effect, Sunstein was suggesting that selective exposure, the fact that consumers are actively making choices about which information to consume, was tantamount to selective exposure leading to echo chambers. If people were active consumers, if selective exposure occurred, people would operate in echo chambers. I'm going to suggest that it's actually a little more complicated than that. I'm going to suggest that, in fact, if you want to create an environment in which people never encounter views that they disagree with, you need selective avoidance. Selective approach by itself is not enough to produce an echo chamber. I'll come back to that idea in a few minutes. But first, let's take a look at the evidence regarding the existence of or prevalence of echo chambers. One of the earliest behavioral studies, these observational tracking studies, was conducted by Garrett and Shapiro. They looked at data representing the behavior of 12,000 ComScore panelists over the course of a 12-month period, and they constructed networks reflecting the news that these individuals consumed. And then they computed an index that described the isolation of any individual news consumer in that environment. And the index ranged from 0, meaning that people operated in an entirely heterogeneous environment. The news that I consumed would be the exact same mix that any other user in the study might consume. And the other extreme of this scale would be a 1. That would be that the news that I consume is unique to only people who also consume the same outlets that I consume. And I don't have anyone in my network of people who consume, say, for example, if I'm a Fox News consumer, then there's no one there who consumes not Fox News with me, who consumes something that I don't consume. We only all consume the same things. So on this scale, from 0 to 1, Garrett and Shapiro found that internet news had a score less than 0.1. That is, there was very little evidence that people were segregating themselves in terms of their news consumption. They were not living in echo chambers. They're not the only scholars to look at this question, though. More recently, in 2013, a group of scholars who had access to data from Microsoft, data collected through Microsoft's Bing toolbar, Bing, that the other Google, over 3 months in 2013. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mean to suggest that 50,000 Bing users is a representative sample, but it is a diverse sample, and it is not a uniquely politically motivated sample, and it's a large sample. They took a somewhat different approach to some of their calculations in terms of how they identified or how they measured segregation, but the basic idea was the same. They constructed an index that went from 0 to 1, where 0 meant heterogeneity in the consumption of news, and 1 meant perfect insularity. And they looked at people's behavior in several different contexts. They looked at how people would consume news when they were getting it through news aggregators, when they were typing in the URLs directly to go straight to the news site, when they were going to a news site by way of a social media link, and when they got there from a search engine. Let's focus on the direct access, the people who typed in or clicked on a link that they had saved for the news organization that they were going to use. As you can see, this is the highlighted section. The scores for news were very low. Segregation is still only around 0.11 on a 0 to 1 scale. So again, it's not an echo chamber. This is not to say that people don't exhibit any kind of bias, but they are not isolating themselves from other viewpoints. Recently, Peterson, Flaxman, and Iyengar have come together to revisit the work that was done with that Bing data. This time they used, it's a more limited sample. They had 1,000 members of the YouGov Pulse panel. So this is a self-selected group of individuals who voluntarily install a tracking tool on their browser. But still, it's behavioral data collected over a course of 3 months, and it was collected during the 2016 election. And what they found was that, again, segregation is relatively low. Now, it's considerably higher than the study conducted in 2013. That could mean that in the lead up to the 2016 election, people were more isolated, were more segregated, were retreating to something more like an echo chamber. But it could also be something about the samples. They were very different samples, and it's just, we can't know based on these data. But it's interesting to see. I would say for my arguments today, though, the important thing to take away is that we are still quite far away from perfect segregation from the echo chamber that had been posited by Sunstein back in 2001. Another way of looking at this is to use Facebook data. So back in 2014, a group of Facebook researchers looked at the behavior of 10 million Facebook users who had self-reported their ideology. Now, admittedly, people self-reporting their ideology are a unique group. I don't know about you, but I haven't told Facebook how I identify politically. However, if they have any bias, my guess would be that these are people who are more politically engaged. And so it would be they would be more prone to engage in selective exposure based on what we know about the literature. What they find is, well, let's take a look here. First of all, the first part of this figure is what would happen if people were randomly assigned news based on all the news shared on Facebook. And you can see that if that were to happen, people's exposure to cross-cutting content would be quite high. They would see quite a lot of the political news they would see would be cross-cutting, slightly higher for liberals than for conservatives, but both groups would have quite a lot of exposure. Of course, Facebook doesn't just show you a random selection of news. They show you news from people in your social network. If you limit the news that people are exposed to a random set of news shared by people in their network, you find that there's a significant drop in cross-cutting exposure, but it doesn't go anywhere near zero. Liberals are still seeing about 25% of the content being counter-attitudinal. Conservatives are seeing about 35%. Of course, again, Facebook doesn't just show random samples of news. They have algorithms that make recommendations about what people are going to be exposed to. The drop there is quite small. So algorithms that are learning from what people have interacted with in the past tend not to filter out much counter-attitudinal information. Finally, this last step, going from the information that people are exposed to, it shows up in their Facebook feed, to what they actually select of the political news that people actually select, we see a very small drop in their potential exposure. They could have chosen about 23, 22%, and they actually chose 21%, or they could have chosen 35, and they actually chose about 30. So there is some selectivity. People are taking into account their political attitudes. But again, they are not choosing to screen out all counter-attitudinal information. The last set of work looking at this echo chamber question, I'm going to summarize much more briefly. Several groups of scholars have done this work under the banner of audience fragmentation. If echo chambers are real, then media outlets should have fragmented audiences. The audience for Fox News should be different than the audience for CNN, which should be different from the audience from MSNBC, and so forth. And all the scholars who have looked at this find time and again that it's not audience fragmentation, but audience duplication. News consumers tend to flock to a common set of news organizations. Users who consume Fox are more likely to consume CNN than not. All right, so what does all of this mean? Well, Peterson and Iyengar, and I would note, Iyengar has long been one of the more vigorous proponents of some version of the echo chamber's selective avoidance perspective, have recently concluded in one of their papers, with respect to political news, partisans differ in their typical media diet, even if they do not completely retreat into echo chambers. I couldn't have said it better. And my argument is that the reason for this pattern is the place that I started. Echo chambers are the product of selective avoidance. If you want people to retreat into insular environments, you have to convince them that they don't want to see counter-attitudinal information. Selective exposure isn't enough. And so the fact that we don't see echo chambers, I take as my first piece of evidence that selective avoidance is in fact quite rare. But let's take this question on a little more directly. So in a lot of experimental work, we contrast people's selection of pro-attitudinal content to their selection of counter-attitudinal content. So in an artificial media environment where those are your only two choices, you can either look at something you agree with or look at something you disagree with. Unsurprisingly, people are consistently drawn to the pro-attitudinal content. So this has been shown over and over and over again. I've provided just a couple of the most well-known sites. Stroud's work and Knobloch Westerwick are both very well known for their work showing this pattern. And it shows up when you look beyond the US, right? It's been shown in Germany, it's been shown in Japan, it's been shown in Israel, and many other places. But the point that I want to make is that that's not sufficient to demonstrate avoidance. Knowing that someone has chosen pro-attitudinal information over counter-attitudinal information could be explained by either selective approach or selective avoidance, or it could be a product of both. Here's another way of explaining that same idea. So we have a 2x2 grid here. Across the horizontal axis, we have the amount of pro-attitudinal information, low or high. And on the vertical axis, we have the amount of counter-attitudinal information, low or high. And when we do one of these studies where we're contrasting pro-attitudinal information, that is a message that is high on pro-attitudinal and low on counter-attitudinal, to a counter-attitudinal message, one that has lots of counter-attitudinal information and very little pro-attitudinal information, the choice could be the product of selective approach. I'm drawn to the pro-attitudinal information, or selective avoidance. I don't want to see counter-attitudinal information. In other words, we've confounded avoidance and approach. We've confounded the presence of pro-attitudinal and the absence of counter-attitudinal. So if you want to sort out what's happening, it helps to add a third condition. Add a message in which there is both pro-attitudinal and counter-attitudinal. In that case, if selective approach is the dominant factor in selective exposure, we would anticipate that the selection of these two-sided messages would be the same as, or possibly even greater than, the selection of pro-attitudinal messages. However, if selective avoidance is present, then people should want to avoid the two-sided message. Why? Because the two-sided message includes the counter-attitudinal information. And the claim of selective avoidance is that people don't want counter-attitudinal information. So pro-attitudinal information attracts you, counter-attitudinal information repels you, and therefore, if selective avoidance is happening, the two-sided message should be unattractive. So there's a bunch of empirical evidence we can use to address this. We'll start with some work that I did with Talia Stroud back in around 2011 when we started this project. So what you see here is we're looking at of the news choices that people could make. People could make multiple new choices. And of all the choices they could make, how many of the pro-attitudinal stories did they choose? What proportion of the two-sided messages did they choose? And what proportion of the counter-attitudinal stories did they choose? And we find that pro-attitudinal and two-sided messages were chosen with comparable frequency. They chose more than half of both of those messages. And they chose a bit less than half of the counter-attitudinal messages. All right, well, that's consistent with this top line here, right? People don't seem to exhibit an aversion to the two-sided message. If anything, they're selecting it more often. It's not, I don't want to make a big deal out of it. It's certainly clear that they're making the same selection. Let's take a look at some other evidence. So De Geersman in 2000 and I guess it was 12, I think, when they were going this data, maybe it was 13, I'm sorry, I've forgotten. Over 2 months in the lead up to an Israeli election, they collected web tracking data, looking at the kinds of news that Israelis were visiting. There were 400 participants in this panel. Overwhelmingly, these individuals' news diets included two-sided outlets. Very few individuals, just 4% of the participants, had news diets that were composed entirely of one-sided, either pro or counter-attitudinal content. Again, doesn't look like avoidance of counter-attitudinal information. Another bit of work from Peterson and Iyengar, looking at some experimental data. They had about 2,700 people in this experiment. It was conducted on YouGov, so they were using a matched sample, almost similar to a representative sample. Half of the sample was in a control condition. And in the control condition, they looked at the choices that people made when they were given the opportunity to select one of 3 kinds of news. People could choose, actually it was one of 4 kinds of news. They could choose in-party sources, out-party sources, or two-sided messages, sources, and expert sources. Now, I've linked expert sources and two-sided sources together since experts are presumably taking into account all perspectives. And you find overwhelmingly people are choosing the two-sided or expert sources over the one-sided sources, and especially now there's a strong preference to two-sided and one-sided in-party over the out-party. So again, there's some kind of selective exposure going, but I would suggest that this looks a whole lot more like selective approach than selective avoidance. One more study to consider. This is another bit of experimental work. Here, the researchers were looking at the probability that someone would select a post on Facebook, and the predictors are whether the post was associated with the in-party, whether it was neutral, or whether it was for the out-party. The top part of the panel is for the outlet orientation, the news outlet. And we see that in-party and neutral outlets were selected with comparable similarity, while out-party outlets were selected less often. Well, that sounds an awful lot like a preference for the presence of pro-attitudinal, regardless of whether counter-attitudinal information is present or not. When they looked at messages that were ideological in terms of the message slant instead of the outlet to which they were attributed, we see a preference for in-party slightly greater than the two-sided or neutral messages and much greater than the out-party. Again, this is compatible with the idea of there may be some selective avoidance, right? They did like the in-party more than the two-sided, but mostly they just don't want to get a news story that doesn't have any of the content that they agree with. People want to see the views that they believe in represented in the news they consume. However, I do want to make one more small point about a contingency here. It is sometimes the case that people actively choose counter-attitudinal information over pro-attitudinal information. Now, this can be expressed in a preference for two-sided messages, right? They might say, well, I don't want the pro-attitudinal message. I really want the one that has two perspectives. It could even, in extreme cases, be, you give me two choices, pro or counter-attitudinal, and I'll take the counter-attitudinal message. And the conditions under which that happens are limited, but it seems to be, in general, when individuals have high utility for the counter-attitudinal information. That is, when people are engaged in opposition research. Your party is about to lose power, and you want to understand what's going to happen under this new regime. In those instances, reading about the new regime that you're about to have to live under for the next 4 years in the US presidential context can be attractive, can be at least necessary. You can be drawn to that kind of content. All right. Finally, let me turn to the relationship between selective exposure and selective engagement. I would suggest that these two ideas are similar in some important ways, but also different. And in particular, what I'm going to argue here is that while selective avoidance in the realm of exposure is relatively uncommon, selective avoidance, when we're talking about engagement with content, is more likely. And that means that echo chambers in the context of engagement are more likely. So first, let me unpack this idea that exposure and engagement are different from one another. There are a couple of reasons that I would suggest this is the case. The first is the point that when you engage with content, well, what do I mean by engagement? In a social media context, engagement often means things like clicking a like button, sharing a piece of content, commenting on that content, which is implicitly a share, because once you comment on Facebook, other people are going to see it. If you retweet on Twitter, you're clearly saying, hey, followers, I want you to see this content. Or perhaps it's commenting on it in a social media platform like Reddit, where you're not explicitly intending to share with other people, but you are promoting the conversation. Your signal, your engagement in the conversation is upranking that story. It's making it more important. Well, in a news environment where you are signaling something like, I like this, you can imagine why people might want to avoid counter-attitudinal content. I don't want to click the like button next to something that I passionately disagree with, because that is going to send the wrong signal. Stroud's lab has done some work demonstrating that if you change the button's label from like to respect, people's engagement changes. People are more likely to engage with counter-attitudinal information when the button says respect than when it says like. Another part of the relationship between engagement and exposure has to do with conflict aversion. So perhaps the reason people don't want to comment on a post that they disagree with is that people are conflict averse. We've known this for a long time. People have been looking at interpersonal conversations and interpersonal communication networks long before the internet. And what did we see? Well, we saw that people tended to want to avoid, in many instances, situations in which they would be in conflict with other people. So I'm putting up the figure from the Genskow and Shapiro article that I talked about earlier, because although before I'd focused on the internet, right, I focused on this column, I want to note that everything here to the left is about consumption of media. People's broadcast news exposure, okay, well, not quite everything, most everything, broadcast, cable, magazines, and so forth. Whereas over here, these are interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal relationships are ideologically more segregated than media environments. And Mutz was able to show something very similar many years before this. So it's not surprising that when you're talking about engagement, whether it's things like liking or sharing, or something like commenting, in both cases, people have reasons to not want to engage with counter-attitudinal information. So let's take let's take a look at some of the evidence around selective avoidance in the social media environment. The first thing we're going to look at is some data collected on Reddit. And what you see here on these charts, on the left side is the ideology of a commenter, where on the horizontal axis, you have the ideology of the author of the original post. So if individuals were engaging in selective approach and selective avoidance, you would expect that the commenting would fall along this diagonal line. That is, strong conservatives would only comment on messages by strong conservatives, and strong liberals would only comment on those by strong liberals, and so forth. Well, what we see in this 6-panel figure, this topmost, the upper left panel, this is the first level comment on a political post, a post in r/politics, for those of you familiar with Reddit. So what you see is, in fact, there is quite a bit of homogeneity. It does look a bit like an echo chamber. Not a perfect echo chamber, but the diagonal is pretty clear. As we move along the figure, though, we move from the top level comment to the second level comment, that is a response to the top level comment, and a third level comment responding to the second level comment, a fourth responding to the third, and so on. And as we move down the comment thread, we find that the pattern grows weaker. Again, there's still some sense that the diagonal is here, but it's not nearly as strong as it was up here. Perhaps even more importantly, what happens when we look in non-political spaces? Well, in non-political spaces, we find that ideology does not have much influence on people's engagement to one another. And these non-political spaces do still sometimes include political conversation. So it's not that people only ever see the other side, but when people are engaging with one another, in a space that is specifically articulated as about politics, they are more likely to engage in selective approach and selective avoidance in terms of engagement. There are also some interesting differences across the various platforms. So I'm going to show a series of, I'm going to explain these four figures here. It's been really interesting. The social sciences have been informed by a bunch of folks who did research in large networks in physics. And so as a result, we start to have maps of people's behaviors that look like they are astronomical phenomena. So what we see in the top left figure, figure A, these are Twitter users who are choosing who to follow. And on the horizontal axis, we have the leaning of the individual, and on the vertical axis, we have the leaning of the people who are their neighbors in this network of followers. And what you see is that there does appear to be a sort of echo chamber. When you focus on people who are talking about abortion, people who follow one another do tend to also link to the same kinds of news organizations. So the pro-choice folks link to one set of news organizations, the pro-life folks tend to link to a different set of news organizations. Again, sharing a link is a stamp of approval, a way of saying you should be aware of this. This is important. Take a look. So it's not surprising that these two camps would divide in this way. Even more pronounced is the distinction between the communities of users on Facebook around vaccination. Now, in Facebook, in this figure, instead of what sites are being shared, we're looking at who comments on posts by who. So we see that people who subscribe to anti-vax sentiment tend only to comment on other anti-vaxxers. And people who embrace the scientifically supported view that vaccines are effective tend only to comment or like comments by people who share their view that science is the way to go. On the other hand, here we see Reddit in B, panel B. We see quite diverse engagement. That is, it doesn't really matter what the leaning of the individual making the post is. The neighbors tend to be pretty diverse. And similarly, on a conservative site called Gab, it doesn't really matter what the individual's leaning is. The neighbors are all basically the same. So people who are highly conservative, people who are a little more liberal, they all tend to have roughly the same kinds of neighbors. Okay, the last bit of evidence about selective engagement is probably most relevant to the topic of the panel, the workshop today, right? This is engagement with debunking posts. These are pseudoscience messages that have been corrected on Facebook. And the question the researchers asked here is who responds to debunking posts? Who comments or who likes these debunking posts? Well, you probably won't be surprised to know that when someone posts a factual correction to some fictional claim, whether it's anti-vax or the earth is flat or what have you, some conspiracy-oriented science claim, the people who engage with the correction, who engage with the debunking post, are more often than not people who are predominantly in that science community. The people who subscribe to the conspiracy theories very rarely will actively comment on or like a claim that their views are wrong. So that's selective avoidance when the behavior is engagement. Another researcher summarized this nicely. She said, if we look at Twitter as a social medium, we see higher levels of homophily and a more echo chamber-like structure. But if we instead focus on Twitter as a news medium, and that is in terms of the kinds of news that people are sharing and being exposed to, we see much lower levels of homophily. Okay, so I began by saying I wanted you to come away with 3 core ideas. The first is that echo chambers are relatively rare. The second is that the reason this occurs is that selective approach is more common than selective avoidance. And finally, I think that it's important that as researchers interested in the question of selective exposure and the presence or potential presence of echo chambers, it's now important that we begin to consider more carefully the relationship between selective exposure and selective engagement. I argue that selective avoidance is more likely in the context of selective engagement. All right, well, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to talking about your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It was a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure it has raised a number of questions and comments. I have 2 thus far, and more will be coming. The first one is from Levi Spectre, who says, "Thank you for this lecture. I am almost convinced, but still have a worry. I don't have too much credence in this possibility, but what would you say about the following explanation of the data about selective exposure? There is no avoidance or approach as incentive-based choice. To the extent that there's a choice, it is rational to choose information that an agent thinks is more likely to be true. That in itself will cause an imbalance toward pro-attitude."
Yeah, right. I think that's an excellent question, and I have sidestepped the mechanism in a sense, right? I'm talking about the relationship between someone's attitude and the choices they make, and I have not said that this is dissonance-based. I have not said that it's actually because the exposure to counter-attitudinal information would be unpleasant. I think there is actually likely to be a constellation of mechanisms that explain attitudinally motivated selective exposure. I think you're quite right to ask that perhaps some of the time it is about the fact that the pro-attitudinal information is seen as more credible. Mary Metzger has done some work to suggest that that is likely to be a part of the calculus that people are doing. I don't think that's all there is to it. Because, well, I mean, it's really hard to untangle the mechanisms, because that means trying to get in people's heads in ways that we don't really have a great way of doing yet. So basically, I guess I would say I don't think that claim is a contradiction or a challenge to the idea that people's exposure is related to their attitudes and beliefs. It's more a question about, well, precisely how is that happening?
All right, thank you very much. The second question comes from Torun Lindholm, who asks, does the tendency towards counter-attitudinal avoidance differ between those who are in a minority versus a majority, given that the minority would perceive themselves to be more threatened?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would suspect that there are 2 mechanisms at work there. One is the threat, as you suggest. So perhaps you would be inclined to avoid counter-attitudinal information when you're in the minority, because exposure to that message might make you feel more doubt, more uncertain. This is related, I think, to Albertine's work, showing that people who have high defensive confidence are more likely to engage with counter-attitudinal content. And if you're in the minority, your defensive confidence might be a little lower. You might be a little worried that, gosh, not many people agree with me. And so even though I feel like I'm right, I mean, I know I'm right, but I'm not sure I could defend that position. And so that could lead someone to avoid counter-attitudinal information. That could make selective avoidance more likely. But let me paint a slightly different picture. If you're in the minority, then you are also more vulnerable. There may be more utility in knowing what the enemy thinks, because you realize that your position needs to be defended. When you talk to, say, for example, climate change deniers, they generally are quite knowledgeable. They're in the minority, right? They are not the majority by any means. In the US, it's unfortunately larger. The number of deniers is larger than it should be, but they're still not the majority. But they're very, very conversant with the arguments. And that's because they want to make the claim that we've read their work, we've done our homework, we know what the evidence says. Right now, we have the same dynamic happening around COVID vaccination in the US. The most vigorous opponents to COVID vaccination, the ones who say, no, I mean, this stuff is dangerous, usually end their diatribe with, well, you really got to do your homework. Stop counting on the mainstream media. So I think that it's complicated. I do think there are circumstances under which selective avoidance will happen, but I don't think I think those circumstances are pretty rare.
All right, thank you very much. Then I have a question on my own. I mean, now you've been talking about selective approach and a selective avoidance more in the aggregate, but of course, in a population, ultimately, we are talking about individuals composed of different groups, which then at the highest level of abstraction becomes the public, so to speak. So if we look at smaller subsets of groups, I mean, for example, Benkler and colleagues in their book on network propaganda show how in the US there are now 2 media ecosystems, whereas in the right-wing ecosystem, you find more patterns of propaganda feedback loops, and it's more insular. So among certain groups, there might be much more selectivity.
So I'm going to make a counter argument. I don't disagree with what you just described. Benkler is absolutely right. The ecosystems, the media ecosystems, are very different. My suggestion, however, would be that you do not need insularity. You do not need echo chambers for radical deviations in what groups believe. So conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats in the US can believe very different things, even if they don't isolate themselves from what the other side is saying, because Republicans trust the conservative media ecosystem. They look around and they say, well, we've got 2 sides of this argument. One side says vaccines are safe. The other side says they're not. One side says that COVID is a real threat. The other side says they're not. One side said the election was fair. The other side says they're not. It's not that they haven't ever heard the arguments from the other side, but that they're making a choice about who to trust. This is back to the question of credibility that was raised earlier. Like, my side is the more credible side. The things that line up with what I believe is generally more credible. And so you don't have to avoid it, but you certainly aren't going to believe it, right? And so I think that this is actually one of the most important reasons that I think we need to get over the echo chamber idea, because the solution suggested when you believe that echo chambers are what's driving the division in beliefs between various groups in modern societies is that you just need to get the 2 sides to see each other, to talk to each other, to look at the same media. And I mean, in one of the more extreme examples of this, Cass Sunstein wrote a piece recommending that we send in what he called cognitive infiltrators, people who would pretend to believe what the rest of the group believed, but their real job was to introduce counter-attitudinal information. Well, if echo chambers are the problem, that would be a great solution. But if they're not, that's going to backfire. That's going to have really serious negative consequences, because if you have a group of people who are suspicious of the other side, who are thinking, well, the other side is prepared to cheat and lie, and so I know I can believe what my side says and the other side is not trustworthy. And then you go and reinforce the sense that, yes, we are in fact willing to lie about who we are and what we believe so that we can try and infiltrate your groups and introduce propaganda to convince you that our beliefs are right. That's not a recipe for success. If, on the other hand, we say, okay, so it's not insularity in exposure, but instead different patterns of engagement, different patterns of trust and belief, well, that raises a whole different set of questions that we have to address when we try and deal with the particular questions of misperceptions and the role that misinformation plays in shaping people's beliefs.
All right, thank you very much. Gregor writes, thank you for a great presentation. The study of Sinelli and colleagues from 2021 seemed to suggest that controversial topics are more likely to produce echo chambers on social media. Conflict aversion might be more important when it comes to such highly emotional topics.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely true that conflictual topics are more likely to see selective exposure and selective engagement. And I think that in the realm of selective engagement, at least, we're more likely to see selective avoidance. With selective exposure, it's not clear to me that we see a lot of selective avoidance around highly controversial issues because, again, it's this tension. On the one hand, in a very conflictual topic, you may feel more aversion to the counter-attitudinal information because you think it's more likely to be untrue, because it's more likely to make you feel uncomfortable, but it's also more likely to have utility. The reason issues become hot button issues is that lots of people are talking about them because important policy is being developed, because an election is coming up. And in those contexts, the counter-attitudinal information is more likely to also be useful to you. So I would anticipate that as an issue ramps up, so in the US, as a Supreme Court case is approaching, or as an election is approaching, you would see sort of a split in terms of selective avoidance. You'd see that engagement, people would be much more polarized in their engagement, whereas in terms of exposure, you might actually see it moving the other direction. People might be more likely to engage with one another. I want to actually, let's see if I can do this quickly. And so Bond, in that same, in the piece looking at Reddit, give me one moment. Bond also looked at the question of what happens over time to engagement in terms of talking with people you disagree with. Give me just one moment. Okay, oops, take that off of there. Can you see the figure 3 correlation in ideology?
No, we only see the old presentation.
Okay, hang on.
Thank you slide.
Let me try that again. Did that work?
Yeah.
Okay. So here we are seeing the correlation in ideology between the original poster and the commenter. So in other words, how much homophily is there? The more correlated they are, the more homophily there is. And what we see is that as big US elections approach, so Super Tuesday, the day after the election, also other important political events like the start of the Democratic National Convention or a shooting in the US, or a judge issuing an order to halt Trump's travel ban, we see that people start engaging with those with whom they disagree around these critical events. So this suggests that utility is dominating, right? As there is a big controversy about well, this judge just issued this order, people who wouldn't normally talk to each other are talking about the same thing and they're engaging with one another. Whereas on Christmas Day, you're not talking to the people you disagree with because it turns out you don't really want to say a lot to them on that day. You're just doing your thing and ignoring them. Same thing on New Year's Day. You're like, yeah, I've got my people. The people I want to talk to happen to share my views.
Very interesting. And that goes both for the last slide and for the whole presentation. The time is now up. It has been a long day for some of us. For others, the day is just starting. But I want to thank everybody who has presented here, and I want to thank all the attendees for this day. There will be a new workshop in the fall. We will come back with more information about that later on. But for now, thank you very much. Have a good day. Stay safe out there.